Welcome to Arise America. I'm Sheila McVicar. We start today with breaking news. President Trump has reportedly cleared the way for the release of a controversial secret memo, which is said to accuse federal law enforcement officials of abusing their surveillance authority. The memo, authored by Republican Devin Nunes, alleges that the Federal Bureau of Investigation and the Department of Justice relied on tainted information to continue surveillance of a Trump operative. The president believes the memo will cast doubt over the legitimacy of the entire Russian investigation. The FBI is furious. This comes as attention also turns to Robert Mueller's interest in that infamous Trump Tower meeting between Donald Trump Jr., Jared Kushner, and a Russian lawyer. But let's begin with the memo. Joining us is Eric Ham, chief political correspondent in Washington. Eric, is there anything that could now stop the release of this memo?
Sheila, absolutely not. In fact, we were told today when the president was returning from his trip to West Virginia at that GOP retreat, there was a White House official on the plane who said that the memo will be released as early as tomorrow and that the White House will not offer any redactions to this memo. And also it's important to note that they also stated that Congress and not the White House will actually be the ones in charge of releasing the memo. So it will actually be Congress, not the White House. The White House is actually giving the go-ahead for the Congress to actually release this memo. So it comes down to Speaker Paul Ryan and Representative Devin Nunes.
Well, there's another organization that is a dog in this fight, and it's reported that the White House is concerned that Trump-appointed FBI Director Christopher Wray might quit. We did have that extraordinary statement from the FBI yesterday urging the administration to not release the Nunes memo. Is this coming down to a showdown between the Bureau and the White House?
Absolutely it is. In fact, we do know from many sources within the White House that there is a concern that the FBI Director Wray could actually resign over this. And what we're seeing is a battle for control of the FBI. And we do know that there is a long-held culture of independence between the FBI and the White House. And so now the question becomes, who actually controls the FBI? Is it the White House who is in charge, or is it the FBI director himself? And so what we're seeing right now is a tug of war between the FBI director and the president himself. And it's interesting because it's the president himself who actually appointed Christopher Wray to this position.
Now, we've heard over and over that Donald Trump, he said this repeatedly to friends, he said this repeatedly to aides in the White House, that he believes that the release of this memo will basically underwhelm the Russia investigation. But what happens if the memo itself is not convincing? And as we're reading now, it reported in several places that some White House staff feel that the memo itself is not as convincing as the president seems to think it is.
Well, if the memo does not actually do what it is intended, and that is to undermine the Mueller investigation, what happens is the Trump White House and the Trump team has to find a different route to go to try to attack both Deputy Attorney General Rod Rosenstein as well as Bob Mueller in their work right now. And so I think, of course, that is the concern, that is the challenge confronting the White House with this memo, because there's been so much back and forth, there's been so much attention placed on it, and if it lands as a dud, I think it means the question becomes, what now does the White House do to try to take the eyes off of this investigation?
Paul Ryan, who supports release of the memo, this afternoon said that the demand for release of the memo is, quote, not an indictment of the FBI. Is that the view from the Bureau and especially from the agents of the Bureau?
Absolutely not, and it's interesting because we were there, and while watching this Speaker Ryan before the press, and he made the comment that this memo does not, and I quote, impugn the Mueller probe or the Deputy Attorney General. And clearly many of the Democrats actually believe that it does. And of course the White House, and not just the FBI, but not just the FBI, and the intelligence community as well, because we're going down uncharted territory here where you're seeing classified information being made public, And because of the sensitivity of the investigation, the FBI simply cannot and most likely will not respond to what's in the memo so as not to jeopardize ongoing investigations. And I think it could be a slippery slope, and it could have an impact on other investigations throughout the FBI.
Well, turning to that Trump Tower meeting, of course, and the Mueller investigation, we're told now that Robert Mueller is very much focused on the Trump response to that meeting becoming public, and especially what 1A Communications Director Hope Hicks is said to have said. Take us through that and why that may or may not be important.
Yeah, this is actually very striking because this goes directly to the heart, again, of the Trump inner circle. And we know Hope Hicks is a longtime confidant of the Trumps. She's very close with the daughter, Ivanka Trump. And so we know that former Trump team legal spokesperson Mark Carallo, a longtime GOP operative here in Washington, will actually be meeting with the Mueller investigation team over the next coming weeks. And he was actually privy to many of these conversations between Hope Hicks and other White House officials regarding Donald Trump Jr.'s emails regarding the meetings that he took at Trump Tower with the Russians. And so it was, and Mark Carallo quotes that Hope Hicks made the comment that these emails would never be seen. And so based on the reporting, it appears that as though she was doing something that might seem as tantamount to obstruction of justice. Now, also keep in mind that Hope Hicks has already met with the Mueller investigation, so it's not like she gets a do-over here. And so this could be very explosive, and we could, again, see another member of the Trump team, someone who's very close to the president, and who also worked for the campaign and is now in the administration. And so this investigation, again, is getting closer and closer to the president.
Eric, we've got about 30 seconds left here. You know, it's not a crime to lie to the New York Times or to mislead any journalist. Why is Mueller interested in this?
Again, because this goes to, and again, Mueller knows more than what he's letting on, and so we don't know what Hope Hicks had said to him, and this could, Mark Carallo's comments could undermine Hope Hicks's, and so we're looking at that, and we do know lying to an FBI official is a criminal offense, and regardless if it's under oath or not. And so we're still watching to see what takes place.
Thanks so much, Eric. The memo has sent shockwaves throughout the Justice Department. Earlier, Arise News spoke with former DOJ attorney Jerry Pettinato. We asked him, what is the FBI most afraid of with the release of the memo?
The danger of exposing this report may not arise from the danger of exposing or disclosing one fact or several facts that this report may contain. The danger may arise from disclosing the network of information that led the United States to learn this information. And in particular, if a foreign nation had shared intelligence with the United States and revealing that information risked that foreign nation's own intelligence agents, then that foreign nation in the future may not so readily share its intelligence with the United States itself. Then, disclosing this report now may, in the long run, undermine the United States' national security interests and may endanger American lives.
To further discuss this standoff, David Rudenstein is with us. He's the Dean of the Cardozo Law School. Thanks so much for being with us, sir. You know, we've heard so much about this investigation over the months, and of course we know really so little about the investigation. But what do we know that tells us about what's at stake here for the FBI and for the national security establishment?
Yeah, well, thanks for having me. I used to be the dean. I'm no longer the dean, right? But what we know from all of the reports that are available is that the disclosure of this memo may in fact compromise two things: sources of intelligence and methods of intelligence gathering. And if there's a red line, which nobody ever wants to cross, it's the revealing of that kind of information, because sources will dry up and sources may in fact become endangered, and if we disclose the methods of communication, then enemies will be able to compromise the future intelligence gathering. So that's what's at stake here, and this is very unusual.
Has there ever been a precedent for this in your recollection?
In my course of study, I would say I don't know of another disclosure like this, and what sets this really apart is that it's being done by the White House. It's one thing for a disgruntled employee to make a disclosure. Normally those disclosures do not disclose methods of intelligence gathering or intelligence sources. They may disclose a program. They may disclose other information that the government doesn't want out, but it doesn't cross that red line. Here we have a red line, and we have the President of the United States basically telling the American people that he thinks we should cross it.
Is this a slippery slope?
Well, it's more than a slippery slope. I would say it's just a straight downward dive, and it's really unfortunate.
What do you think happens then with the president's relationship with his Department of Justice, with his FBI, with his national intelligence community, with whom he has already had a somewhat strained relationship?
Well, I think you have to ask what he's trying to accomplish by this, right? I think what he's trying to accomplish is greater control over all of these entities. And these entities historically have been independent from a fair amount of political influence. So we look at the FBI, we don't think of the FBI as the political arm of the White House, but perhaps that's what this White House has in mind. You look at the Department of Justice and you actually say the Department of Justice is supposed to do justice. It's supposed to be even-handed and fair-minded with regard to all the American people, and not to do the political bidding of the person who happens to be in the Oval Office. Well, from all of the comments that this president has made over the last year, it seems that he rebels against that kind of institutional independence that the Department of Justice is supposed to have.
Well, we've had reports that he has referred to the Department of Justice as the Trump Department of Justice. There was a report yesterday that he asked the Deputy Attorney General, his own appointee, Rod Rosenstein, if he was, quote unquote, on my team. As you said, this is unprecedented, where the president seems to feel that these are people who are there to serve him and not to serve the Constitution and the American people.
That's the fear. I think that's the fear that we all have, and what we don't know is where this is going. If you remember back in American history during the McCarthy period, there were these so-called witch hunts, and they were spearheaded by the Congress. What I'm afraid is likely to be coming our way is that the White House may try to use the justice and investigatory arms of the Justice Department and the FBI to engage in their own version of a kind of a McCarthy witch hunt with regard to its political enemies. I can see no other reason as to why the president is so determined to undercut the independence of these well-established institutions.
Let me ask you a technical question that I think we've not well explained to our audience. What is a FISA court, and what do you have to do to get a FISA court warrant? What's the standard of proof, the burden of proof?
Well, the FISA court's a secret intelligence court that was set up in the late 1970s as a way of reining in presidential surveillance of Americans. And it put the court between the American public, if you will, and the president. And so it functions as an ordinary court. The judges are Article III judges, they're federal judges, but their identities are normally, well, until recently they were confidential, now they're more public. Their proceedings are secret. And in order to get a warrant, you have to comply with the statutes. That's what they did here. And, you know, the judges on the FISA court are not known to be very liberal judges. So they had to meet the standards, they got the warrant, and they engaged in this surveillance.
And so if you were an FBI agent or a DOJ official preparing a warrant to go before a judge, it's not going to be a 3.5-page memo, like the memo we've been talking about for the last week.
Well, I've never actually seen a FISA court warrant application, but I believe they're pretty hefty, and I believe that you have to make out a pretty strong case. FISA judges are known to occasionally reject warrants, which makes the Justice Department self-disciplined about when it goes forward. And so I think we can pretty much assume that the application here lived up to the standards that were expected.
David Rudenstein, thanks so much for joining us. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank
Okay.
you. Yet another school shooting in the United States, this time in Los Angeles. It's the 14th school shooting this year. A female student, the chief of the Los Angeles School Police Department, says she is 12 years old, opened fire shortly before 9 a.m. at the Castro Middle School just west of the city's downtown. 2 students were shot. Police say a 15-year-old boy is in critical condition. The other is in fair condition. Authorities have the shooter in custody. Up next, the disgraced Olympic doctor has pled guilty. But what about the institutions who reportedly let him get away with it? You're watching Arise America.
Larry Nassar is a criminal of the worst kind, a cunning, methodical serial child molester, and I hope you sentence him to behind bars for the rest of his misery.
The victims of disgraced Olympic doctor will certainly get their wish from the judge in Nassar's third sentencing hearing. But responsibility for Nassar's actions is expanding. 2 state attorneys general are investigating whether institutions associated with Nassar, from Michigan State University to the U.S. Olympic Committee to USA Gymnastics, long knew of his abuse and did nothing. And today, a Michigan Police Department apologized for doubting an athlete who came to them in 2004. Wallace Ford is an attorney and professor at Medgar Evers University. Let's begin by talking about the fallout from this case. We know that Larry Nassar is going to be behind bars for a very long time, but there appears to be responsibility that lies with others, including institutions, Michigan State University, where we have seen some resignations, and now the U.S. Olympic Committee, USA Gymnastics. What is their culpability? What is their responsibility to the victims here?
Well, one of the things, actually, this ties in directly with a lot of the academic work that we do, and we teach our students who study nonprofit organizations, for example, at Medgar Evers College and any place else that you can think of, which is that there's something called fiduciary duty, which is that you have a responsibility to other people. In this case, what we're talking about is the members of the boards of directors of the USOC or USA Gymnastics and so on. They had a responsibility to the people that their organizations were working with, particularly the young people and their parents. And the question becomes, did they carry out that duty, that responsibility properly, given all that we're finding out over 20 years worth of abuse and activity? And it's hard to imagine that no one knew anything during all that period of time.
So does the burden of responsibility increase if an institution or individuals in a position of responsibility in an institution had knowledge?
Well, see, in this instance, it's something either knew or should have known. Okay, and what they knew is obviously a question of fact, and that can be that can come out during litigation. And although, again, as I said, it's hard to believe that no one knew anything, particularly members of the boards of directors who really have a responsibility for oversight as to what goes on in these organizations. But there's the should have known part that I think is really important. What we do know is that youth sports is a magnet for child predators, and so you have to be especially careful if you're going to run youth sports programs to make sure that the people who are in constant contact, very close contact with these young people, are not predators or certainly do not engage in that type of predatory activity. And that's where I think you've got a real problem with these organizations.
And you also had the great big warning bell going off that was Penn State and Jerry Sandusky.
Well, of course, Penn State, again, is going back decades, and you could even talk about the Catholic Church, for goodness sake.
Yes.
It goes back many, many decades that we're talking about this activity. But in each and every instance, I would submit that this knew or should have known type of construct should have been applied. And if you say, if certainly at Penn State they knew or should have known about the activity of Jerry Sandusky, and that the officials of the Catholic Church knew or should have known about the predatory activity of too many priests and other employees of the Archdiocese, then you have, when you look at the USOC, you have to say again, either the board of directors knew or should have known or should have made serious inquiries or taken the proper steps to protect just basic screening, for example, on a regular basis of the personnel involved might have saved some of these young ladies from the really disgraceful activity that they had to endure.
And so when you talk about the known or should have known, are you talking about something that is criminal? Or where there is only civil responsibility?
Well, see, that's an interesting question that you ask, and as a criminal case, you've got to show mindset, of course, his state of mind. Did people intentionally ignore the kind of information that we're finding out about now? Did they have a duty to do this? Were they negligent? Were they just willfully ignorant of some of these types of situations? That's going to the prosecution may have a difficult time there, but on the civil side, I think the organizations themselves certainly should be concerned about their culpability, and of course the members of the boards of directors as well as executive management should be concerned on the civil side.
Is there a statute of limitations that comes into play?
Well, I don't know the exact state. In this country it goes state by state,
right.
And that's one of the things that we'd have to see what happens in terms of that. But I would think that particularly with respect to the civil cases, that you might have a lot more leeway in terms of when, because you can't bring a suit until you find out about the damage in the first place.
I want to turn to talk about the judge a little bit.
Mm-hmm.
This was a judge who very much was in command of her courtroom, but who some critics have suggested that she stepped out of line,
mm-hmm.
that she went too far in the way in which she both addressed Nassar, the way in which she permitted the victims to speak, and the way in which she was seen in the courtroom to clearly comfort and to console the
mm-hmm.
victims. There's some sound, we've got some sound of that judge that I'd like to play, and
sure.
that we can take a listen to, just to remind us of,
mm-hmm.
of the flavor of her courtroom.
Okay.
It's my honor and privilege to sentence you. Because, sir, you do not deserve to walk outside of a prison ever again. You have done nothing to control those urges.
So Judge Aquilina there, a little difficult to hear, but
mm-hmm.
She did go, and her critics said she went too far. Has she left herself or this case up for grounds for appeal?
Well, I think it's going to be very hard to appeal because, of course, what we're listening to there is a sentencing after the verdict, after the trial, and I'd heard no complaints about her impartiality during that process. After there's a verdict, after this gentleman, Mr. Nassar, is found guilty, it's hard to say that in her sentencing she's displaying some type of prejudice, which did not come out at all during the trial proceedings. The one thing I have to just say very quickly about victim impact statements, of course, is that typically are very emotional, and they're victims, for goodness sake, right? And so they're not going to be saying anything nice about the defendant and now the person that's been convicted of these things, and it gives the victims some sense of closure. That's one of the reasons why we have them in many jurisdictions at this point. But we can hear that obviously can also make it seem like any subsequent sentencing is prejudiced by those statements. I don't think that there's going to be much of a case for overturning or appealing any aspect of this judge's decisions.
You talked about the know or should have known. Is there an argument to be made that the categories of people who are now mandatory reporters, people who are obliged to go to the authorities when behavior of this kind comes to their attention, should those categories of people be expanded?
Well, I think they should be, first of all, enforced as they are. I mean, I'll give you, again, a very quick example. My son was in Harlem Little League for 7 years, and I was a coach and during those times, and I was not allowed to set foot on the field, even though my own child was on that field, until I went through a screening every year. Okay,
wow.
Because Little League USA mandates that. Why? Because these places, as I said before, youth sports is a place that attracts these predators, and so it frankly doesn't matter how many people are required to report, as much as that they actually do report, that there's actual screenings, and just because I passed the screening last year doesn't mean that I shouldn't be screened this year.
Wallace Ford, thanks so much for being with us.
My pleasure. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Okay.
Another casualty of changing American views of workplace harassment and abuse. The American Red Cross General Counsel David Meltzer has resigned. Last week, ProPublica reported that he had mishandled a sexual misconduct case involving another senior employee. In spite of being found guilty of harassment by an internal investigation, Meltzer ensured the executive got glowing reviews and that his history was not revealed to his new employer. Up next, Trump and the TV rating game. Plus, if you wanted to get that flamethrower, we'll tell you why you're out of luck. You're watching Arise America. A huge claim from President Trump today, this time over the size of the audience watching his State of the Union address. In an early morning tweet, the president wrote, "Thank you for all of the nice compliments and reviews on the State of the Union speech. 45.6 million people watched, the highest number in history," end quote. Unfortunately for the president, that's not true. According to the ratings tracker Nielsen, his State of the Union was the 6th most popular, behind those of George H.W. Bush, Bill Clinton, and Barack Obama. Just a little reminiscent of his claims about the size of his inauguration crowd. Now for a look at the day in business, Andrew Schmertz, U.S. business editor, joins us. So today they called the Super Bowl of tech earnings. How'd everybody do?
So three big tech names, Apple, Amazon, and Alphabet, which is the parent company of Google. We'll start with Apple because that's the biggest of them all. Apple, disappointing sales across the board. iPhone estimates fell short of estimates. Sales of iPad fell short of estimates. Mac fell short of estimates. Revenue, however, beat estimates, among the best revenue ever. So Apple, disappointing though. There's a small sell-off of the stock this afternoon after the bell. That's to be expected. Apple saying iPhone sales very challenging because of the iPhone 10 price, plus there's a lot of models out there. So Apple, stock to watch in the future. Amazon hitting it out of the park though. Revenue coming in at $60.5 billion. That's ahead of estimate. Earnings double what was estimated.
Wow.
Especially strong for their cloud and business service, AWS. Very strong on Whole Foods. Remember, they purchased Whole Foods. So Amazon reporting very strong earnings. Alphabet missing across the board though. Earnings per share missed by 18 cents. The ad business a little bit soft. Overall though, the revenue was up, and Amazon for the first time ever reported $100 billion in sales for the year.
Just to go back to Amazon for a second and those great earnings, is that a reflection of the online shopping thing and the turn away from brick and mortar retail?
Sure, Amazon continues to drive that. Amazon has also moved a good part of its business to a cloud-based. They're working on a bit for businesses. What's AWS? That came in very strong, and brick and mortar doing well for them actually. If you look at Whole Foods, so they're driving profits at Whole Foods. So across the board, Amazon probably the standout among those three.
So there's a blockbuster forecast about the growth of the U.S. economy from the Atlanta Fed. What do they say?
So the Atlanta Fed does a GDP tracker and issues estimates of where the GDP is going, and they're expecting 5.4% growth.
Wow.
That is a blockbuster number, as you just said, would be the best since the financial crisis, and would suggest that the economy is really kicking on all cylinders. That will continue to see employment drop. Tomorrow we get those employment numbers, continue to see wages go up. Really good news across the board, but also more ammunition for the Fed to raise interest rates at their next meeting.
Well, I just wanted to ask, with that kind of growth being predicted, isn't there also a risk of inflation?
Yeah, so inflation is the specter that hangs over every booming economy. We haven't seen it in 10 years now, which has been a very low inflationary environment. We are seeing it creep into consumer prices, creep into wages, and an economy going at 5.4% growth would suggest that too.
But the man who coined the phrase irrational exuberance, great phrase, has a warning for investors. What's former Fed Chairman Alan Greenspan saying?
He says we're in a bubble. We're in a bubble on two fronts, stocks and bonds. He says the bond market is in a really big bubble, and the stock market is looking like a bubble. So the stock market up 49% since Donald Trump's election. And so he believes that we're going to be in for a correction. And he did correctly predict when the internet bubble collapsed. So there's a lot of analysts out there who disagree with him, who say that the strength of the economy is going to continue with the bull market, but it is certainly overbought from his perspective. I would listen to him.
Okay. The Trump administration has been trying to kill the Consumer Financial Protection Board, and today it took another step in that direction. First, tell us, what's the Consumer Financial Protection Board? Why do we care? And what did they do?
So this was Senator Warren from Massachusetts' big project, and Barack Obama and the Democratic Congress passed it. It is another regulatory agency that manages the banks, that oversees credit cards, that serves as an extra set of regulators for the financial industry to protect consumers, and it had yielded a tremendous amount of enforcement power, and it acted very much outside of Congress. Trump administration says it was unconstitutional. They lost that argument in an appeals court decision yesterday. Today, they removed the enforcement power from the board, and instead they will focus on education. So took the teeth right out of the board, what some would say. But many Republicans had said that it really tied the hands of companies trying to sell products and raise the cost of all the financial services.
So finally, my favorite story of the week, Elon Musk and the flamethrower. Can I still get one?
No. You're out in the cold if you didn't get a flamethrower. It sold for $500 on Elon Musk's Boring Company, which is a transportation construction company that he's using for various projects. He always joked that he was going to next sell flamethrowers, and guess what? He went out there and did it. It was a huge hit. Sold $10 million worth of them. Has closed the store. You cannot buy one for your next party.
Did Elon Musk expect that he was going to sell $10 million worth of flamethrowers?
I don't know. He probably has to go out and source them now if he did not, and deliver them. He put it out there. It got a lot of PR. I have to believe that if he said, he tends to think that he can do what he says, and therefore if he would do it, that it would sell.
Andrew Schmertz, thanks so much.
Thank you.
Thank you. Next, a gruesome mass grave discovery. We'll have all the details. You're watching Arise America. Now to a horrific story out of Myanmar. The Associated Press confirming the discovery of more than 5 mass graves. We warn you that some of the pictures are graphic. The video evidence collected by the AP shows that a massacre took place in August at the Rohingya village of Gurdarpian in northern Rakhine State. That is the same state where military abuses were widely blamed for driving more than 500,000 Rohingya Muslims to flee into Bangladesh. The government denies any massacre took place. Bodies of the victims were found days after residents say soldiers stormed the village. The faces of men half buried in the mass graves had been burned away by acid or by bullets. Survivors interviewed by the AP said the soldiers carefully planned the attack and then tried to hide what they had done. Also in Myanmar today, 2 Reuters journalists detained on charges of violating secrecy laws were back in court today for a bail hearing. The pair were arrested in December after meeting with police officials in Yangon, the country's commercial capital. They had been reporting on the situation in Rakhine State. Joel Simon is executive director of the Committee to Protect Journalists. Joel, thanks so much for joining us.
Thank you.
Let's begin with the situation in Myanmar. These 2 journalists are in jail for reporting on this situation in Rakhine State where this alleged atrocity took place. How difficult is it for reporters to do their job in Myanmar?
It's incredibly difficult. Obviously, this is a huge international story with tremendous implications. You've got allegations of a massive campaign of ethnic cleansing, forcing hundreds of thousands of Rohingya into exile in Bangladesh. So this is an enormous global story, and the government of Myanmar is extremely sensitive, and it's taken a number of measures to restrict coverage, including denying access and now this repressive action against these 2 Reuters journalists.
Is it possible to know why the government has targeted these 2 Reuters reporters in particular?
I think there's just sensitivity to the story and an effort to ensure that critical coverage send a message about their sensitivity. So I think it was we don't really know. We don't really know precisely what the government was thinking. These journalists seem to have been set up. They went to a meeting with military officials at a restaurant. They were given documents. Immediately after being given those documents, they were arrested. So the best guess is that they wanted to set some sort of example and make clear that they would not tolerate this kind of reporting.
Now, they've been held in prison. There was a bail hearing today.
Yes.
Bail was again denied.
Right.
What is the Committee to Protect Journalists asking the government of Myanmar to do?
This is very simple. We're asking that they be released. At the minimum, they should be released on bail so that they can mount an adequate legal defense. These charges, we believe, are without foundation. They're punitive. They're baseless. We think they should be dropped altogether. But at a minimum, they should be released on bail. And I should say that obviously this is the message that we're conveying. But there's a global message. There's a huge international outcry and response. The General Secretary of the United Nations today spoke out. He has done so previously, and he spoke out again today. The U.S. government, European governments around the world, journalists around the world. There's really and this is something that's very positive. There's been a very strong international response.
Is there evidence that beyond the arrests and detention of these two Reuters journalists, that the government is carrying out a campaign against other journalists, including Rohingya journalists who are trying to document what's happening?
Well, I was in Myanmar over the summer and had an opportunity to meet with journalists there in Yangon and also with government officials. There's no question. When Myanmar made a transition to democracy, one of the hallmarks of that transition was the opening space for the media. It was for a long time one of the most repressive and closed countries in the world. And journalists were released from prison, many who had been held there for extended periods. There was an opening in the media. Exile media returned and began working. And that space is closing. There are restrictive laws. These are not the first journalists to be imprisoned. There have been others. Access to Rakhine State is extremely limited. It's basically impossible at this point to get access. So that's why so much of the reporting involves speaking with exiles and refugees who are now in Bangladesh.
Turning now to another story which is capturing attention, and that is in Kenya,
Yes.
in Africa. So we've seen this series of events take place where there is an election is overturned,
Right.
a second election is held, there is a mock inauguration on the part of the loser, if you will, didn't participate in the second round of elections, which is deemed a treasonous act by the government of Kenya,
Right.
and they then try to suppress both reporting of this and broadcasting of this.
Yes.
What's the situation in Nairobi now?
Well, the situation in Nairobi is, as you mentioned, the opposition candidate, Raul Odinga, held what he, as an act of protest, a mock inauguration. Prior to this inauguration, the government called in members of the media and said, you may not cover this. This is prohibited. A number of broadcasters said, we have an obligation to cover this. This is a legitimate news event. So 3 of these private broadcasters were shut down. They were taken off the air. They were accused of incitement to violence. The government has made very strong statements. There's been a Supreme Court ruling that this ban be lifted. They be allowed to resume broadcasting. But as far as we know, they remain off the air.
So in defiance of a ruling from the Supreme Court, these broadcast outlets remain shuttered.
No, what happened was the president and the administration warned them not to cover this mock inauguration, and they defied that request and covered it anyway. And then after the government sort of pulled the plug on these broadcasters, the Supreme Court ruled that ban was not legal, but the government has not yet complied and lifted the ban and allowed them back on the air.
What kinds of fears does this raise for press freedom in Kenya?
Well, it's potentially a constitutional crisis. I mean, you have to keep in mind that Kenya has a history of a vibrant, vigorous, independent media. It's really a beacon for East Africa, for all of Africa, and for the world, really. And so this is a huge setback. It really calls into question the commitment of the government to freedom of the press. Freedom of the press is not easy. It's precisely in these moments of crisis when it is challenged, and when the people of Kenya need access to this kind of information when these kinds of political challenges are being played out. And so the government is not meeting its commitment to its own constitution, to its own history, and to its international obligations. So it's a very difficult and troubling moment.
You know, over the course of the last year, we've heard much from President Trump, much that has attacked the news media in this country. We have heard examples where others around the world have cited the example of President Trump. How much do you think his words against the media in the United States, where there's First Amendment protection, are having influence in other places in the world?
Well, let's say this for sure. It doesn't help. I mean, the U.S. should be inspiring countries around the world with its respect for the role of independent media, instead of inspiring people with this new trope of fake news. I mean, the example we started was Myanmar, and in Myanmar, the government has called reporting on the Rohingya crisis fake news. So it's provided a very convenient new framework for repressive governments to justify their action in controlling the media. And we see new laws coming on the books criminalizing fake news. Journalists around the world, last year we had a record number of journalists in prison around the world, 262. One thing that's interesting, the number of journalists jailed around the world, while still a fraction of the total number, has more than doubled, from 9 to 21. So we're seeing this as a convenient framework, convenient justification around the world, and so that is indeed very troubling.
Joel Stein, thanks so much for joining us, Committee to Protect Journalists.
Thank you.
South Africa's drought-hit city of Cape Town is introducing new water restrictions in an attempt to avoid what it calls Day Zero, the day in mid-April when it might have to turn off most taps. At a natural spring where residents converge to fill water containers, tensions are growing. The city is now taking over management of the site because of the increasing noise and traffic congestion caused by people collecting water around the clock. With Day Zero approaching, authorities say they might have to turn off most of the city's taps if residents don't start saving more water. Up next, a love letter to Motown. You're watching Arise America. It's February 1st, and that means it's the first day of Black History Month. Throughout the month, Arise America will be highlighting achievements and contributions of African Americans to world and American history. To get us started, author Herb Boyd joins us. He recently penned a book titled Black Detroit, A People's History of Self-Determination. He calls it part history book, part memoir, and love letter to the city. Welcome, Herb.
Hey, I like that love letter. Indeed it is, yes.
Tell me about your connection to Detroit.
Well, I was raised in Detroit. I was a part of the migration just before World War II really heated up from Alabama. It's a straight line migration from Alabama to Detroit. So going all the way back to the Underground Railroad, Detroit, because of its location, the proximity to Canada, when the fugitives from out of the South running away from slavery and everything arrived in Detroit, they thought they was in the promised land. But they discovered that slavery also existed in Detroit. So they found they had to go a little bit further, go across the river to Windsor, Canada. So it's that location that's important in terms of the Underground Railroad and starting the migration of these refugees, you might say, from the South coming to Detroit as opposed to Chicago or Philadelphia or Cleveland or New York City. So it began to populate it. By World War I, you have a heavy concentration of African Americans in this city, and it's going to create a number of problems.
So tell me about the love letter part. Not only is this your hometown, but it's clearly someplace that's very close to your heart.
No doubt about it, because it's like the old expression, you know, you take your culture with you no matter where you go. And Detroit is with me all the time. And certainly in the sense that my mother is there. And she played a tremendous role in pulling this book together, because I just kind of plowed through her memories and everything along with my own, along with a lot of research too. And that's the kind of the culmination of this particular 300 years of Detroit history, all the way back to its founding in 1701, down to the moment, to all of the bankruptcy and everything. So it was a pretty long episodic trip, you might say.
I think you call your mother one of Detroit's fearless freedom fighters.
Oh, no doubt about it. Just such a remarkable woman, and you go back to when she arrived, right almost in the heart of the race riot of 1943, and she was an eyewitness to that. She was in the street. She saw, black men getting shot down. In fact, one black man was shot pretty much in half. That was enough to send her back indoors and not to go back out anymore. So that was pretty much her introduction to Detroit, because she had come a couple times before. But by 1943, we were there. I was there. I just arrived a couple of months before the riot broke out. So, hey, hello, Detroit. Here I am. And we thought that it was going to be an easy ride, a smooth sailing. But it was some rough moments there, the turbulence, the kind of challenges that black people face in that city. And that's what I talk about in the book, how we've overcome all of these obstacles, all of these challenges, and some of them pretty daunting.
There are photos of the book. There's lots of photos in your book, but there's one of you with Alex Haley and Rosa Parks.
Whoa.
There's one with Rosa Parks and Coleman Young, the city's first black mayor. What are those moments like?
All of it, like going back over, digging into the repositories and the archives and the museums and interviewing people. But more than anything, it was like my own memories of that city. And I was pretty much involved in every facet of it in terms of the economic, political, and cultural life of that city. I find myself at the Wayne State University, for example. I spent 15 years there, and it was a good perspective, a good platform to observe the kind of changes that went on in this city. Detroit has always been a very dynamic city, and I think what I'm trying to say in the book is that how pivotal that city is, not only U.S. history, but world history. Beginning with slavery, right down to the automobile industry, the big three, they're all there. The whole labor movement evolved there. When you get into the 1920s, when Henry Ford makes his offer, right on into the 30s, when you have the rise of the labor movement, into the 40s, the coming of World War II, the arsenal of democracy is right there.
Well, it's also the birthplace of Motown.
Oh, yes.
And I think no history of Detroit would be complete without talking about Motown. Talk about the impact of that on the city.
Well, you're talking about the industry and the genius of Berry Gordy and the connection to a very solid, enterprising, entrepreneurial family, just absolutely full of gifted individuals, including his sister Esther and his father and uncle. All of them were involved in the creation of Motown, which the music becomes like the soundtrack of a generation, if not further, future generations. That music is everywhere. And what Berry did, he worked at Ford Motor Company. And he recognized something there in terms of the manufacturing process, in a whole assembly line. And he just took that and more or less superimposed that on a whole cultural development there in terms of all the talent that existed in Detroit, the musicians, the singers. It was just like a plethora of musicians that he just began to pull them into his
sort of
network.
a magnet. It was a magnet city, and that he was a...
And he has this charisma, too, and the genius as a songwriter himself. And then he had an individual as a co-partner. Somebody was riding shotgun with him was Smokey Robinson. And he brought all of these songs there, and Berry told him, you got some beautiful songs here, but make sure you tell a story. There's a beginning, a middle, and an end. And so that was the lesson that he embodied and put it to Smokey, and Smokey just turned out a whole treasure trove of songs that we all know.
In the short time we have left, we know in recent years that Detroit has struggled and suffered, and its people have struggled.
Exactly.
How do you see the future of the city?
Well, I'm a cockeyed optimist, and I see the signs of rejuvenation. I see the signs of resurgence. Detroit has always had that ability. When you go back to the fire, back in 1805, when the city was virtually destroyed by fire, they had to kind of kind of pull it up and rebuild, and so it's always had that kind of rejuvenation, no matter what kind of tragedy beset it. You know, whether it was a race riot of 1943 or the rebellion of 1967, we managed to come back from these setbacks. So I see it happening. The bankruptcy, it was a temporary blip there, but we see now where people in Detroit, the self-determination part of the book, that's always going to be a part of this kind of Detroit spirit. You go downtown Detroit, you see this huge statue, it represents the spirit of Detroit, and that is like without end. It's like something that I recognize, and how the young black people there and the music, contemporary music, as well as the urban agriculture that's going on there. People are going to feed themselves.
Herb Boyd, thanks so much for
Thank
joining
you,
us.
It's a
Thank
pleasure.
you. That's it from us. Thanks for watching Arise America.